She burned 280 people alive, she imprisoned her sister, she executed a teenage queen, she silenced dissent with fire, all in the name of God. Queen Mary I of England turned her reign into a ritual of death. But was it justice or vengeance disguised as faith? Why did a queen become history's Bloody Mary? She didn't raise a sword, she didn't lead an army, she didn't have to. All she needed was a pen and fire. Between 1555 and 1558, Queen Mary of Rome of England sent 280 men and women to the flames. They were not rebels, they were not assassins, they were not traitors by any political measure. They were Protestants, ordinary people, preachers, merchants, midwives, teachers, who refused to return to the old faith. For that they were tied to wooden stakes, surrounded by bundles of dry kindling, and set ablaze in front of watching crowds. She believed she was saving their souls, but what England saw, and what history would never forget, was smoke, and skin blistering into ash, and screams torn apart by wind. It began quietly. No royal decree announced a purge, no public speeches called for fire. It started with a single name, John Rogers, a preacher who had helped publish the first complete English Bible. He was arrested, tried, condemned, and on a cold February morning in 1555, he became the first Protestant martyr of Mary's reign. His wife and 10 children stood nearby as the flames climbed his body. He refused to scream. He prayed instead. The fire crackled, the smoke choked the air, and Queen Mary, hundreds of miles away, likely believed that heaven had just received another purified soul. But one death wasn't enough. Soon, 2 more followed, then 5, then dozens, and then it was impossible to count them as individuals. They became a list, a grim roll call of the faithful: Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer, Saunders, Hooper, Bradford, Rawlins, Warne, and Glover. Each name marked by fun had a body reduced to charcoal and a death framed not as punishment, but as penance. She called it restoration, a return to the one true faith. But the people called it something else: terror. In Smithfield, London, the cobblestones grew dark from the blood and fat of the burned. In Oxford, bishops once praised for their intellect were gagged and chained like thieves. In provincial towns, Canterbury, Lewes, Colchester, heretics were dragged from their homes and turned into public warning signs, their deaths announced days in advance to draw a crowd. The spectacle was intentional. Mary wanted them to be seen. She wanted the faithful to witness what happened to doubt. She wanted the scent of burning flesh to linger in the streets like incense, so that every citizen, rich or poor, noble or beggar, would understand the cost of spiritual rebellion. She didn't hide behind bureaucracy. She personally signed the warrants, consulted her bishops, and demanded theological examinations of every accused soul. She asked not us, have they sinned, but rather, have they recanted? And if they didn't, she made no distinction between man or woman, young or old, clergy or layperson. Fire, after all, made no distinctions either. There were those who begged her to stop. Advisers whispered that mercy would gain her favour. Foreign ambassadors expressed horror. Parliament grew restless. Even her husband, Philip of Spain, cautioned restraint. But Mary was unmoved. She had known humiliation. She had been declared illegitimate, separated from her mother, banished from court. She had seen her father dismantle the Catholic Church piece by piece, and now, with the crown finally on her head, she believed she had been chosen by God, by history, by divine right, to cleanse England's soul no matter how many bodies it took. And so she burned them, one after another. Some recanted, some did not, some wept. Others sang hymns while the flames took them. Crowds gathered, at first out of curiosity, later out of fear. Children clung to their mothers, vendors sold bread and cheap wine near the execution sites. Priests chanted, and the sky over England darkened with the smoke of belief turned into execution. In Mary's mind, this was salvation. In the eyes of the world, it was carnage. So we must ask, not with anger, not with mockery, but with the weight of history in our hands, what drives a woman, once broken by injustice, to rebuild herself out of fire? And once the flames begin, how does anyone, even a queen, make them stop? Before she became the most feared monarch in English memory, Mary was a child with a crown carved for her before she could walk. She was born on February 18, 1516, in the cold stone walls of Greenwich Palace, the first and only surviving child of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, a long-awaited miracle after years of miscarriages, stillbirths, and royal disappointment. From the beginning, she was celebrated as a blessing, a girl whose very existence was wrapped in prophecy and promise. Her mother, fiercely devout, saw her as a gift from God. Her father, though desperate for a son, adored her, at first. She was raised with every privilege of the Tudor court, tutors fluent in Latin and Greek, musicians to hone her ear, painters to immortalize her youth, and a stream of foreign ambassadors who marvelled at her intelligence and poise. They called her the Pearl of England, bright, articulate, pious, a royal daughter destined to become a powerful queen, perhaps even a unifier of kingdoms through a brilliant marriage abroad. But royal favour, like fire, can shift with the wind. When Mary was just 17, the world she knew crumbled beneath her. Her father, having tired of Catherine and obsessed with securing a male heir, broke with the Pope, declared his marriage invalid and married Anne Boleyn, a move that didn't just rearrange the royal family tree, but shattered the centuries-old authority of the Catholic Church in England. Mary's life was undone by a signature. She was stripped of her title, no longer princess, but Lady Mary. She was declared illegitimate, a bastard in the eyes of the law. Her household was disbanded, her jewels confiscated, her right to inherit gone. Even worse, she was forbidden from seeing her mother, the woman who had raised her in faith and dignity, now dying alone in exile. Mary pleaded for permission. She wrote letters. She wept behind closed doors, but the answer never changed: no. From then on, Mary was a prisoner in all but name, moved from one cold castle to another, surrounded by guards, watched by those loyal to the new queen, forced to share households with the infant Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and yet, through it all, she refused to bend. She would not acknowledge her father's new marriage, she would not renounce her mother's queenship, and most of all, she would not give up her Catholic faith, not for comfort, not for safety, not even for love. Those years in exile forged something unshakable in Mary. Not just bitterness, not only grief, but conviction, the kind that only grows in silence, in suffering, in solitude. She spent her nights in prayer, her mornings in cold chapels, her days reading the same Latin scriptures her mother had once whispered into her ears. She believed that one day justice would return, that her father's sins would be answered, that England's soul, once so holy, would be restored, and that she, Mary, daughter of Catherine, child of the true queen, would be God's instrument to do it. But time did not heal her wounds. Instead, it layered them. Anne Boleyn was executed. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate too. Yet Mary's position remained uncertain. She was occasionally allowed back at court, but always with suspicion, always surrounded by spies and servants loyal not to her, but to the crown's newest version of truth. She had no husband, no child, no allies strong enough to protect her. And still, she endured. Year after year she held fast, like a candle burning in the wind, refusing to die out. She watched as the realm shifted again and again, Henry with 6 wives, reformations reversed, policies rewritten, queens rising and falling like waves against a stone. And beneath it all, Mary waited. Not because she was ambitious, but because she believed she had been wronged, and that God never forgot the innocent. She was the daughter of the old world, a world of confession, of Latin prayers, of incense and relics and eternal truths carved into cathedral stone. And when her moment finally came, she would not hesitate, because no one had ever taught Mary how to forgive betrayal. They had only taught her how to survive it. Mary Tudor never expected to wear the crown, not after everything they took from her. She had lived too long in the margins, too long in silence, too long under the shadow of others' ambitions. Her father's desperate search for a son, her stepmother's downfall, her brother's cold embrace of the new faith. She was tolerated, not embraced. A royal in name, but not in presence. A daughter of the old regime, watched closely, spoken of quietly, moved like a pawn across the board of dynastic insecurity. And yet, in the summer of 1553, the tide shifted. Her half-brother Edward VI, the sickly son of Jane Seymour and King Henry VIII, had reigned for 6 years, short, turbulent, and fiercely Protestant. Under his rule, altars were stripped, Latin banned, monasteries erased. Mary had survived his reign by hiding her faith behind locked doors, hearing secret masses, and bowing only when forced to. He died at just 15, leaving behind no heir, only a council determined to keep the Protestant Revolution alive, no matter the cost. That council had a plan. Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, young, intelligent, and devout, was married off to the Duke of Northumberland's son and proclaimed Queen the moment Edward's breath left his lungs. The move was bold, calculated, and entirely illegal. Mary was still next in line according to Henry VIII's Act of Succession. But legality mattered little to those who feared the return of Catholicism more than they feared the wrath of heaven. Mary didn't wait for permission. She fled from London, gathered supporters in Norfolk and Suffolk, and within days her name echoed through the countryside. Farmers, nobles, soldiers, priests, women, tradesmen. They came not only because they believed in her, though many did, but because they feared what England would become if the throne passed through backroom dealings and forged wills. And so she rode, not as a silent daughter anymore, but as a claimant to the crown, commanding armies with the force of belief behind her and the ache of years in exile beneath her armour. It was not a war. It was barely a campaign, because England turned. Thousands rallied to her side. The people of London refused to support Jane. Even members of the Privy Council, the very ones who had signed Jane's accession, began to defect one by one. On July 19th, 15, just 9 days after Jane's reign began, Mary was declared Queen of England. She was 37 years old, unmarried, childless, scarred by abandonment, hardened by humiliation, and now finally crowned, not by fate's mercy, but by a country desperate for order, legitimacy, and something familiar after years of doctrinal whiplash. The bells rang across the city, the people cheered, even those who feared her religion welcomed her hand, for now, and Mary, riding into London with a cross held high before her, knew exactly what she intended to do. I will restore the true faith. This was not a vague promise, it was not a gesture. It was a declaration of war, not of blood at first, but of soul, of spirit, of ritual. She reinstated the Latin Mass. She welcomed exiled Catholic bishops back into England. She repealed Protestant reforms, re-established papal authority, and surrounded herself with advisers who believed, as she did, that the kingdom had gone astray and needed to be brought back by divine correction. But Mary was not simply reviving ceremony. She was reclaiming her mother's legacy, vindicating her own childhood, and rewriting the script of her life, one in which she was no longer the shamed daughter of a discarded queen, but the rightful monarch ordained by heaven to bring her people back to salvation. She believed it with her entire being. She had suffered for the church, she had wept for it, she had risked her life in its name. Now she would reign in its light, and in that light she saw no room for compromise. Yet outside her court, beyond the hymns and gilded robes, the streets hummed with hesitation. England had changed. Not everyone wanted to go back. The young had grown up without Latin prayers. Ministers feared purging. Citizens whispered about Spain, about fair, about chains hidden beneath velvet. But Mary didn't hear the whispers. She heard only God, and God, she believed, had placed a sword in her hand. At first, the change felt ceremonial. Church bells rang again in Latin. Altars returned to stone. Gold-threaded vestments emerged from dusty storage, and incense once more curled toward vaulted ceilings like a long-forgotten memory. Parishioners who had grown used to simple wooden tables and English psalms now knelt before candle-lit icons, unsure whether they were stepping backward or kneeling into a trap. The reforms came fast, but not yet with fire. Mary repealed Edward VI's Protestant laws. She reinstated the heresy statutes from her father's time. She brought back exiled Catholic bishops like Edmund Bonner and Stephen Gardiner, who had waited patiently for England to remember its roots. And across the land, Protestant ministers were quietly removed from pulpits, their sermons interrupted, their churches reclaimed. Still, the streets remained calm. The people watched, wary but not yet afraid. Many remembered the old ways with fondness, even reverence. They had not asked for upheaval, nor were they certain who had the better claim on truth. After years of doctrinal swing, Catholic, Protestant, then something in between, England stood still, uncertain whether it had finally arrived at peace or was merely pausing before another storm. But in 1554, the first flame was lit. His name was John Rogers, a scholar, translator, and preacher who had helped produce the first complete English Bible. A man known not for violence or rebellion, but for language and scripture. When he refused to stop preaching Protestant doctrine, he was arrested. When questioned, he would not recant, and when condemned, he accepted death without appeal. On the morning of February 4th, 1555, he was led through the frost-covered streets of Smithfield, past a silent crowd toward a stake surrounded by wood and straw. His children, all 10 of them, stood in the front row. His wife, pale but unmoving, watched with clenched hands. And as the torch was lowered and the fire began to rise, he lifted his voice in prayer. He was the first Protestant to be burned alive under Mary's reign. But he would not be the last. The execution was public, purposeful, ritualized. It was not hidden in back alleys or carried out at dawn. It was performed like theatre, staged at the city's heart, where merchants sold bread and wine beside kindling and priests murmured blessings while the condemned inhaled smoke instead of air. And from that moment everything changed. Mary saw his death not as cruelty, but as cleansing. To her, Rogers was not a man of conscience. He was a heretic, a soul infected with error. And if the body must burn for the soul to be purified, then so be it. What followed was not chaos, but a system. Within weeks, more arrests followed. Preachers, bishops, commoners, tailors, weavers, widows, had spoken too freely in taverns, some had refused to attend Mass, some had simply owned English Bibles. They were questioned, pressured to recant, offered mercy if they returned to Rome, but many would not. They believed their faith was truth, and Mary believed theirs was poison. She signed the warrants, the bishops oversaw the trials, and the stakes were built higher. The fire moved from London to the countryside, to Canterbury, Gloucester, Norwich, Lewis, Colchester. The names blurred, but the pattern held. A public confession, a swift sentence, a crowd gathered to witness not justice, but doctrine made into death. The symbolism mattered. This was not execution for its own sake, it was meant to be sacrifice. It was supposed to frighten people back into the arms of the church, to show that the fires of Smithfield were a pale reflection of the eternal fire that awaited those who defied God. And still the crowds came. Some cheered, some cried, some turned their heads away, but no one could forget what they saw or what they smelled. The stench of burning flesh, once rare, now became a feature of English city life. The air near cathedrals was thick with it. Children played in fields blackened by ash. Market stalls shifted slightly farther from the execution squares, but not out of sight. The fear was spreading, and so was Mary's message. She would not be her father, a man of shifting policies and broken vows. She would not be her brother, a child manipulated by advisers. She would be the queen who cleansed England, not with war or rebellion, but with fire and obedience. And once the first spark was lit, the flames refused to go out. The fires did not fade, they grew. What began as isolated executions in London soon spread like a lit fuse across the entire kingdom, from cathedral towns to farming villages, from college chapels to quiet marketplaces. The Queen's justice arrived not as ink on parchment, but as smoke curled skyward, rising above thatched rooftops like a warning to the heavens. They came for Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, 2 old men, bishops once admired for their piety and intellect. Men whose sermons had filled churches and guided conscience. They were not rebels, they were not insurgents, they were scholars, spiritual architects of England's Protestant shift. And for that they were bound to a single stake and burned together in the centre of Oxford, while the university town stood still and watched 2 minds reduced to flame. As the fire took them, Latimer turned to Ridley, voice cracking but clear enough to reach the crowd, and said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." And that line, that single line, would haunt Mary's reign more than the screams. But she didn't stop. She couldn't, because with each refusal to recant, with each defiant voice, she saw not bravery but blasphemy. And if her kingdom would not willingly return to Rome, then it would be led back through fire, even if the path was made of corpses. And so came the turn of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the architect of the Book of Common Prayer, a man who had placed the crown upon her mother's rival, Anne Boleyn, a man who had helped destroy the very church she now sought to restore. He was a prize, a symbol, a target. At first he recanted, Not once, but several times. He begged forgiveness, admitted error, wrote signed confessions, pleading for mercy. It was everything her bishops had wanted. But it wasn't enough for Mary, because he wasn't just supposed to recant, he was supposed to be erased. Publicly, visibly, burned like the rest. And on the morning of his execution in March 1556, Cranmer stood before the crowd, expected to repeat his confession one last time, but instead he withdrew it all, proclaiming the Pope to be Christ's enemy and denouncing the fires as cruelty, not redemption. Then, as the flames rose, he thrust his right hand, the hand that had signed the recantation, directly into the fire and held it there. "This hand hath offended," he said, and he let it burn first. There was no script for this, no prayer Mary's bishops could offer to undo what the crowd had just witnessed. A man, terrified, broken, yet choosing agony to reclaim his soul from their grip. And still, she pressed on. The executions multiplied. Mothers, fathers, widows, children, some burned in pairs, others in groups of 4, 6, even 13. Their names faded from records, but their deaths did not. In towns like Lewes, entire families were set alight together. In Canterbury, the flames burned for days. In Colchester, they ran out of wood and began using pitch. These were not distant crimes whispered in dark corridors. These were spectacles, announced in advance so that townspeople could gather, so that children could watch, so that every citizen would learn, not from scripture, but from smoke and skin, and the death toll rose. By the end of 1557, over 200 people had been executed. By the following year, that number reached 280. The fires had names, the martyrs had faces, but the Queen, she remained unflinching. In her court, the executions were viewed as divine necessity. Her bishops reassured her. Her conscience, shaped by years of exile and humiliation, felt righteous. Each fire to her was not cruelty, it was penance for the sins of a nation. But outside the palaces and chapels, something darker began to settle. Not fear, not rebellion, but grief. Grief so deep it no longer cried aloud. Grief that lingered in the markets where smoke once rose, grief that buried English sons and daughters in soil that still smelled of ash. Mary had a hope to save souls, but instead she had turned her kingdom into a funeral pyre, and somewhere between the first execution and the 200th, the people stopped praying for their queen and started whispering her name with fear. Mary did not want a companion. She wanted a king. At 37, she was the first crowned queen regnant of England, not the wife of a king, not the mother of an heir, but a sovereign in her own right, ruling a divided nation with her father's stubborn blood and her mother's wounded piety. She was powerful, but alone. She had waited her whole life for justice, for dignity, and when the crown finally touched her brow, she wanted not only to restore the true faith, but to seal it with a royal match that would make heaven smile. She chose Philip of Spain. He was 10 years younger, handsome by courtly standards, and more importantly, Catholic, heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. The union, in Mary's eyes, was ordained. It would solidify the return to Rome. It would produce a Catholic heir. It would vindicate her mother's name, her own suffering, and the years England had wandered in spiritual ruin. But from the moment his name was announced, the country recoiled. To the English, Philip was not a husband. He was a foreign invader cloaked in marriage vows. Whispers of Spanish soldiers flooding the countryside. Fears of England becoming a satellite of the Habsburg Empire. Protestants, terrified of more than just fire, now feared colonization, and within months rebellion stirred. Wyatt's rebellion broke out in early 1554, a Protestant-led uprising that saw thousands march toward London, crying out not just against religion, but against the Queen's Spanish alliance. It failed, crushed by loyalist forces, its leaders executed, but its impact was deep and irreversible. Mary responded with fury. She ordered the execution of Lady Jane Grey. The teenage girl, once crowned queen for 9 short days, Jane was barely 17, imprisoned for over a year, soft-spoken and devout in her Protestant faith. Mary had kept her alive until now. Jane died on the scaffold, her small frame trembling, her eyes blindfolded, her lips whispering Psalm 51 as the axe fell. Mary also imprisoned her own sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who despite her silence had become a beacon for Protestant hope. Elizabeth was taken to the Tower, interrogated, watched night and day. She claimed innocence, but Mary did not trust her. And while these women vanished into cells and execution chambers, Philip arrived, tall, reserved, cold. He did not speak English, he did not smile often, and he did not love her. To Mary he was a divine answer, a knight of the church come to fulfill prophecy. But to Philip she was a political obligation, aging, deeply devout, useful only if she produced a son. They married in Winchester. The ceremony was lavish. The palace walls gleamed with gold and red, but behind the curtains there was no joy, no intimacy, no warmth. And soon Mary believed she was pregnant. Her belly swelled, her breasts grew tender. She stopped menstruating. The court rejoiced. A Catholic heir would silence England's doubts and root her reforms in blood. But the baby never came. Month after month the pain worsened. Her body ached, her mind darkened, her servants whispered about false signs and phantom symptoms, and still she waited, until finally even she could not pretend. It had been a phantom pregnancy, no child, no future, only shame. Philip left England shortly after. He returned to Spain. He wrote cold letters, addressed her formally, never with affection, and Mary, abandoned, childless, publicly humiliated, retreated deeper into prayer and penance. But where once her religion had been a comfort, it now became a furnace. Her private grief translated into public judgment. She prayed harder, fasted longer, consulted with harsher clergy, and the fires, instead of dying, were stoked with greater urgency. Because if she could not be mother to a child, then she would become mother to a purified England. If her womb was empty, then her conscience must be full, and if the world would not love her, then God must. The burnings continued, not as political spectacle, not even as deterrent, but as offering. She gave England bodies, she gave heaven souls, and with each execution she tried to fill a void that even royalty could not name. Behind the crown she was crumbling, but Mary would never admit defeat. She believed she was being tested, not broken, and with Philip gone, Elizabeth imprisoned, and smoke still curling through the streets, the Queen turned to the only thing that never left her, the fire. By 1557 the smoke no longer inspired awe, it inspired resentment. What had once been the solemn spectacles, the crowd gathered, the prayers muttered, the flames rising like incense into grey London skies, had begun to sour into something else, something harder, something colder, something whispered in corners, exchanged between glances, passed in silence down alleyways and market stalls. Even those who had once supported Mary, those who had welcomed the return of Latin Mass, who had bowed before crucifixes and kissed the hem of Rome's authority, now found themselves asking the same unspoken question: how many more must burn? Because the fires were no longer rare, they were routine, a feature of public life, a steady rhythm of death woven into the calendar. Every week, somewhere in England, a man or woman was bound to a post, offered a final chance to recant, then consumed in front of friends, neighbours, children, and heaven. And with each execution the crowds grew quieter. They no longer gasped. They no longer prayed. They stood still, stone-faced, as if witnessing a ritual not of salvation, but of state cruelty disguised as divine justice. Even Catholic voices began to tremble. Parliament, once loyal to Mary's crown and her mission, refused to approve additional funds for the burnings. Some members spoke of mercy, others of optics, but the underlying sentiment was clear. The fires were no longer purifying the soul of England, they were blackening it. Foreign ambassadors stationed at court wrote nervous dispatches back to Madrid and Rome, reporting not only unrest but a slow erosion of loyalty. Even Spanish nobles, allies by blood and faith, urged Mary to show restraint, to trade fire for forgiveness, to consider the danger of creating not unity but martyrs. But Mary could not hear them. She had long since closed her ears to politics and her eyes to consequence. To her, mercy was betrayal. To halt the executions would not be an act of kindness, it would be disobedience to God himself. She had not endured decades of exile, humiliation and spiritual war, only to stop short of total cleansing. The kingdom's sin was deep, its soul was sick, and repentance, real repentance, required fire. Her inner circle had grown smaller. Even her advisers began to fear her silence more than her speech. Few dared question her, fewer still challenged her conscience. The bishops who remained loyal doubled down, preaching sermons of damnation, citing ancient councils and fearful scripture, telling the people that salvation was worth any price, even the screams of their neighbours. But the people no longer believed it. They still went to Mass. They still lit candles. But their prayers were no longer for the Queen. They were for themselves, for their families, for the missing, for the accused. Because accusation was no longer reserved for the outspoken. It could find you if you owned a banned book, or refused to attend the Latin liturgy, or if your neighbour whispered the wrong thing to the wrong official. The fear was total. But it was no longer holy. It was bitter. It was sour. And it was quiet. The name Bloody Mary had not yet been written in books, but it was already forming in the mouths of her people. Not shouted, not carved in public walls, but passed down like a curse from father to child, from wife to husband, from victim to witness. She burns more than she blesses, they said. And though Mary never heard them speak it aloud, she must have felt the shift. The coldness in the crowd, the absence of cheers, the silence after every smoke-stained execution. But instead of pausing, she doubled down. She increased surveillance. She tightened control. She ensured that those who dared speak against her would not live long enough to repeat the error. And still, the fires kept burning. But they no longer felt like instruments of God. They felt like signs, not of salvation, but of a queen losing her grip on the very kingdom she believed she was saving. The wind was changing. Not in the court, not yet, but in the streets, in the homes, in the hearts of those whose faces no longer turned to the sky when the flames rose. And soon, even Mary's body would begin to betray her, just as her country already had. The queen who lit the fires could no longer keep warm herself. By late 1557, Mary's body had begun to fail her too. Not suddenly, not with drama or collapse, but slowly, relentlessly, like a fortress that crumbles not from cannon fire, but from years of unseen cracks spreading through the foundation. She was 41, but felt much older. Her joints ached, her skin turned pale, she wept often, sometimes without reason, sometimes without sound, and still she prayed. Each morning began with Mass. Each night ended in cold silence. In between, she consulted bishops, signed death warrants, and waited for letters that never arrived. Because Philip was gone. He had returned to Spain the year before, offering promises of return but sending only brief impersonal letters, written like reports to a colleague rather than affection to a wife. He had taken up arms in the endless wars of his dynasty. He had other crowns, other palaces, other kingdoms to claim. And in truth, he had never truly belonged to Mary, not in heart, not in mind, not even in flesh. And yet, she loved him still. She clutched his portraits. She whispered his name at night. She convinced herself once again that she was pregnant. The symptoms returned, bloating, nausea, missed cycles, and with them the hope that God had finally chosen to redeem her suffering with life. She began preparing for the child. Announcements were drawn, midwives consulted, rooms readied, but once again no baby came. It was another phantom pregnancy, or perhaps something else. Some modern historians speculate it was ovarian cysts. Others suggest uterine cancer. There are notes of severe abdominal pain, swelling, chronic bleeding, symptoms that worsened with each month. But no diagnosis was ever confirmed. No autopsy was performed. All we know for certain is that Mary, the Queen of England chosen by God in her own eyes, was dying, and dying slowly, and dying alone. Her people no longer visited. Her court grew quiet. Even her own council began to prepare for her death before she took her final breath, because they knew who would rise next. Elizabeth, the sister Mary had once imprisoned, once interrogated, once feared, was back at court, walking the halls like a shadow of the future, quiet and observant, never pushing but never apologizing. She said little, she made no moves, she waited, and the kingdom waited with her, because they knew, as Mary lay in her chamber wrapped in blankets and silence, that the reign of fire was ending. Not with revolt, not with battle, but with fatigue. The burnings had slowed, not by decree but by inertia. Fewer arrests, fewer trials, fewer crowds. The fires had devoured their fuel both in flesh and in faith, and now only the ash remained. On November 17th, 1558, Queen Mary of Fréjus died at age 42, surrounded not by mourning nobles or a wailing nation, but by silence. There were no grand processions, no outpouring of grief, no international tributes. Her husband did not return, her people did not weep, and her name, once hailed in mass, once painted in gold, became a whisper of warning. Elizabeth ascended within hours. She reversed Mary's reforms within days. Latin vanished from churches. The Pope's authority dissolved. Protestantism returned, not gently, not kindly, but firmly, like a tide that had been held back too long, and the fires stopped, just like that. No more public burnings, no more heresy trials, no more death by smoke. It was as if Mary's death had ended the need for flame, as if the fires had only ever lived because she willed them to. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, but even in death her rest was not her own. Years later, Elizabeth would be buried in the same tomb, on top of her, and the inscription would read, "Partners in throne and grave, here we lie, Elizabeth and Mary." But history remembered only one, the one who ruled after the fires, the one who inherited a kingdom charred, ashamed, and aching for peace. And so Mary, once a princess of prophecy, once a queen of divine vengeance, was left to rot not only in body but in memory, unmourned, unloved, unforgiven. Her voice vanished, her cause abandoned, her faith reduced to a cautionary tale told in classrooms and candlelight. Because England had moved on, and the woman who once made the sky dark with smoke had become at last just another name in the soot. History did not wait to bury her. It began before the soil had even settled. Mary Tudor, once crowned with fanfare and prayers, once praised as the saviour of England's soul, was not remembered as a queen who restored the Catholic faith, or as the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, or as the first woman to rule England in her own right. Instead, she was remembered by two words, Bloody Mary. The name didn't come from her people in her lifetime. It came later. It was coined by Protestant chroniclers, shaped by English reformers writing during Elizabeth's reign, printed in pamphlets, etched in Protestant sermons, whispered in schools and households as a warning of what happens when religion turns to fire. Her deeds were twisted into legend, her policies reduced to cruelty, her motivations flattened into madness. The childless queen who burned for faith became a caricature of tyranny, a cautionary tale, a face that no longer belonged to a woman, only to a nightmare. And so her image vanished. Portraits of Mary were taken down or quietly moved to storage. In churches and palaces, tapestries bearing her emblem were replaced. Stained glass once dedicated to her was removed or shattered. And in the grand myth of Protestant England, her name became the black mark on a national conscience now devoted to the triumph of Elizabeth. Mary's reforms, however sincere, were forgotten. Her charity to the poor was ignored. Her education, her multilingual brilliance, her efforts to stabilise England's finances, none of it survived in public memory. All that remained was fire, and from that fire the myth grew. They told stories of her stalking the halls of her palace, whispering to ghosts. They imagined her eyes glowing red at night, haunted by the screams of the martyrs. They portrayed her as a fanatic queen who drank blood, who danced around burning pyres, who smiled as the smoke rose. And from this myth something even stranger emerged. Not reverence, not study, but folklore. A child's game, a chant. Say her name 3 times in the mirror and she'll appear. That's how she lived on, not in prayer books, not in history texts, not in royal archives, but in playgrounds, in sleepovers, in horror films. She had been a queen. Now she was a ghost, a curse, a dare. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary! Few remembered that she was once a young girl exiled by her father. Few recalled how she stood against Jane Grey's unlawful coronation with the force of a loyal populace behind her. Even fewer knew of the loneliness, the illness, the isolation that consumed her final years, because it was easier and more entertaining to make her a monster than a woman. In contrast, Elizabeth, her younger sister, the Protestant heir, the survivor of the Tower Bomb, became a legend of light, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, defender of England's soul. And where Elizabeth rose in myth, Mary was pushed deeper into shadow. Even Catholics hesitated to reclaim her. Her legacy was too scorched, her actions too controversial. To defend her was to defend the burnings, and a few were willing to carry that torch. And so Mary's story became one of distortion through silence. No grand tomb, no marble statue in the Parliament, no feast day, no pilgrimage, just a few forgotten plaques, a shared grave beneath the abbey floor, and the memory of smoke. What England remembered was not her coronation, but her pyres, not her prayers, but her executions, not her pain, but her flames. She had tried to save the country's soul, but in doing so she lost her own, not in God's eyes perhaps, but in history's. And now, when the world speaks her name, it does so not in reverence, but in fear. A nursery curse, a ghost in the glass, a symbol of belief turned weapon. Because in the end, Mary Tudor was not erased by her enemies. She was rewritten, not as a ruler, not as a woman, but as a warning. And in that perhaps she suffered a death crueler than the pyre. She ruled for just 5 years, and in that short time 280 people were burned alive. Some were priests, some were mothers, some were barely adults, some died screaming, others died singing, but all of them died for what they believed. And she, Mary Tudor, Queen of England, signed the orders, one after another. She believed it was justice, she believed it was mercy, she believed it was the will of God. But belief, when placed above empathy, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. Her reign left behind no heir, no victory, no legacy carved in triumph. Only ashes scattered across fields where grass grew back slow. Only names etched into memory not as rebels, but as martyrs. Only questions, still hanging centuries later. How does a woman, broken by her father, betrayed by her country, abandoned by her husband, transform into a monarch capable of such cruelty? Was she driven by vengeance, blinded by faith, or did she simply believe with every breath that fire could cleanse a kingdom the way pain had once burned through her? The truth is not clean. It never is. Mary's story is not one of monsters. It is one of wounds. A child declared illegitimate. A girl forbidden to see her dying mother. A princess taught that obedience was holy, and that suffering was the price of salvation. By the time she wore the crown, she had already spent 2 decades swallowing humiliation in silence, and when she finally spoke, it was through fire. She didn't murder for land or gold. She wasn't driven by madness or greed. She believed she was doing the right thing, and that is the most terrifying part. Because when cruelty wears the face of virtue, when oppression speaks with the voice of salvation, who dares argue with the flames? She was not the only ruler to kill for belief. Not the first, not the last, but she is the one we remember by her fire, and perhaps that is why her name still echoes, not in reverence, but in warning. Bloody Mary! A nickname passed from textbooks to folklore, from sermons to mirror games, from royal chambers to haunted bedrooms, but behind that name was a woman, lonely, frightened, determined to be loved by God, if not by people. She thought she was saving souls, but all England saw was smoke. When I think of Mary Tudor, I don't see a monster. I see a woman swallowed by her own righteousness. She tried to fix the world by force, not realizing that faith cannot be forced, and redemption cannot be legislated. She burned people because she feared hell more than she feared being hated. She thought pain was holy if it came with prayer, and in doing so she became the very thing she once suffered under, a power that punished belief. Her reign is a warning, not just about religion, but about certainty. Because when someone believes they are absolutely right, and that everyone else must be purified or stipulates, the pyres are never far behind. So the question remains, can conviction ever justify cruelty? And when belief becomes law, not questioned, not debated, but enforced by pain, how far will the flame spread? That question is not just about the past. It's about now, and it's about tomorrow. Because fire never forgets, and history always remembers, even when we try to rewrite it in smoke.